Hey guys, tonight we begin with the slow creak of a wooden door. Not grand, not carved, not even straight on its hinges. Just a plank nailed to another, hanging crooked against the wind. It opens not into a castle or chamber, but into a space. So small, a grown man can barely stretch without touching both walls. The ground is dirt. Not metaphorically, actual dirt. Packed from years of footsteps, softened only by the occasional leak from the thatched roof above. The straw in the corner isn't furniture. It's the bed. Shared, likely. Damp. Always, if you're still settling. Maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing only if it feels right. Let me know where you're watching from. What time is it for you? Because tonight, we're not going to walk through tapestries or tapestries of grand halls. No. Tonight we are crawling into the forgotten corners, the worst places to sleep, to eat, to simply live in medieval times. The places not remembered in books, but worn into the hands and backs of the people who survived them. We'll stand in crumbling towers where the wind never stopped howling. We'll tiptoe into cellars that were once homes, now moldy and hollow. We'll listen to the silence of plague houses where even the mice stopped scratching. But in each place, someone lived. Someone lay down each night and hoped for morning. Someone found a way to be warm when nothing else was. This is not a story of kings. It's a story of cold fingers wrapped around a chipped mug, of sleep that came only after the rain stopped falling through the roof, of quiet suffering that somehow always continued. So take a breath, let your shoulders drop, and let's begin. Our first stop? A leaky hut near the moors, where the roof is more suggestion than structure, and the cold comes in like an old friend, uninvited. The wind did not knock. It simply arrived, slipping through the loose seams in the wall, brushing past the low-hanging rafters, and curling itself between the straw bedding and the skin beneath. This was not a home in the way you and I picture one. It was a shelter, loosely, though not from everything. The roof bowed under its own patchwork weight reeds, and sod clumsily layered by hands, too tired to fuss with perfection. There was no hearth, only a ring of stones where fire had once lived. Now it was just blackened memories, and a few hopeful. Ashes. A kettle hung lopsided over the stones, rust nibbling away at its bottom. The smoke, when there was any, didn't rise with dignity. It wandered, confused, into every corner before giving up entirely and slipping through a crack in the wall. If you were the one sleeping here, and sometimes you'd press your back against the warmest thing in the room, which was likely someone else, maybe a child, maybe your mother. Warmth wasn't found in blankets, but in bodies. And even then, it wasn't enough to chase the chill, only to soften it. When the rains came, which they often did, the roof spoke in drips. First one, then another. The drops rarely followed rhythm. They found their own path, one trailing onto your neck, another soaking the only dry bit of cloth you owned. Buckets and bowls lined the floor, not to catch rain for drinking, but to keep sleep from being wetter than waking outside. The moor stretched like an endless breath held too long. There was nothing beyond it. No neighbors, no road, just the soft rise and fall of land that had long forgotten joy. In summer, the grasses hissed. In winter, the mud swallowed boots and refused to give them back. Inside, the walls were alive, with sounds, wood settling, wind whispering, mice braving the corners. The door didn't latch properly, and sometimes, in the middle of the night, it creaked open just enough to let in a sigh of air that smelled of peat and loneliness. No one bothered fixing it anymore. What was the point? Tomorrow it would still be broken, and so would the roof, and so would the floor. But the people inside, they weren't broken. Not completely. Every evening they returned. From digging, from hauling, from bartering, from burying. They returned with shoulders lower than when they left, but they came back, and that meant something. Dinner was rarely more than turnips and dreams, but it was shared, and that, too, meant something. When night fell, it didn't so much descend as seep in through cracks, under the door, past the shutterless window. It was thick and unmoved by candles. Candles were precious. Light wasn't free, and neither was wax, so they used the dark, got familiar with it, learned to navigate their world by feel, not sight. A footstep here, a cough there, a hand reaching, out in the dark and hoping it found something soft. They laughed, sometimes, quietly, over nothing. A misstep, a fart, a memory. Laughter wasn't forbidden, just rare. When it came, it was like light without flame, brief, beautiful, and gone too soon. They slept when they could, not because the conditions were ideal, but because exhaustion was heavier than discomfort. Sleep came like a thief, stealing them one by one, even as the wind tapped out lullabies on the roof. The straw crunched under weight. The bodies shifted, and the world outside, wild and wide, kept spinning dots sometimes in that hut. You could feel the past and future folding into one, because nothing ever really changed. The walls might rot and be rebuilt. The roof might fall in and rise again, but the cold would still come. The rain would still find its way through, and someone would still lie beneath that roof, listening to the hush between drips. No one envied the leaky hut, but no one forgot it either, because in its wet, smoky corners lived a kind of honesty that grander homes rarely knew. Nothing was hidden here, not the cold, not the hunger, not the love, and sometimes that was enough. It looked magnificent from the outside. Tall spires, stone arches, banners rippling in the wind, the kind of place you might think held comfort behind every heavy wooden door. But if you were one of the many who lived inside the castle, not by birthright, but by broom, your world was smaller, darker, colder. The kitchen was where your day began, long before sunlight even considered visiting. There was no rooster's crow to wake you, only the shrill voice of someone slightly more powerful than you, shouting down a spiral stairwell. You moved quickly, because speed was survival, and the stone beneath your feet was always cold. No matter how many rushes they laid, or how close the hearth blazed, you never wore silk, your hands never touched gold. You were not one of the ladies or lords who floated past in perfumed clouds. You were part of the steam, the soot, the groan, of wooden wheels and iron pots. You smelled of turnip peels and damp wool, and yet you were vital. Everything they touched had passed through your hands first. The halls were long, but they were not wide, not for you. You walked the edges, head slightly bowed, pressing your back to cold stone when the nobility swept by. Eye contact was not expected. Names were rarely spoken. You were not invisible, just unimportant. You slept wherever you were allowed. Sometimes it was near the ovens, curled beneath a table. Other times in a storage room where sacks of flour made better pillows than straw. If you were lucky, you found warmth near the animals. Less so for the smell, but at least their breath warmed the air. And on especially cold nights, even a goat's company felt like a blessing. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below, and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. Meals were strange. You prepared food you'd never eat. Roasted birds with spices you couldn't pronounce. Thick meat pies destined for mouths that never thanked. And yet you found scraps. A broken crust here, a spoonful left behind there. You ate standing quickly, with one eye watching for someone more important than your hunger. There were moments, though, when the world slowed, when the sun angled through an arrow slit and caught dust dancing in the light, when the great hall emptied and you could walk across its floor without scurrying. when another servant shared a joke, or passed you a piece of cheese just because. Hands never rested. They scrubbed, carried, peeled, chopped, lifted, bent, and each task had its own rhythm. Cleaning boots meant a kind of quiet reflection. Hauling water up endless stairs meant you knew your heartbeat better than most. Sewing in the lamplight meant you dreamed with your eyes open. At night, the castle didn't sleep. Not really. It moaned. Wood shifted. Wind slid along its stones. Somewhere, someone was always awake. Guards pacing, torches flickering. A noble. Child crying for their nurse. You learned to sleep in pieces, in pockets of silence. A doze here, an hour there. Deep sleep was a myth, something you imagined rich people had, along with baths and cushions. But even here, even in the belly of grandeur, you found moments of your own. A place near the chimney where your fingers could thaw. A song hummed while scrubbing linens. A view from the top tower staircase where, just for a moment, you could see the hills beyond the walls and remember what a sunrise looked like. When it wasn't framed in stone. No one romanticized your life. Not even you. But you held it quietly, with a kind of stubborn pride. You knew which floors creaked, which nobles treated the staff with a flicker of kindness, which doors needed a hip to close, and which ones screamed when opened. The castle had secrets, and most of them whispered through the servants first. You knew who was sneaking where, who drank too much wine, who locked their doors too tightly. But you didn't tell. That wasn't your power. Your power was in keeping things going. Fires lit, floors clean, meals ready. You were the breath behind the pageantry. And so you moved through it all. Unseen, yes, but also unshaken. Because while the nobles postured and preened, you endured. While they dined, you scraped. And while they slept in canopied beds with down pillows, you curled against stone. The sound of your own breath the only lullaby. You might dream of escape, or at least of shoes without holes, or a morning where your fingers didn't ache. But mostly, you just kept going. And in the quiet, in the rhythm of work, in the warmth of a shared glance or stolen crumb, you found something no tapestry could weave. You found a way to belong, not to the castle, but to the living that happened inside it. There are places in this world designed without love. Places that exist not out of care or craftsmanship, but necessity alone. The outhouse over the river was one of them. Perched on a brittle platform of mossy wood and long-forgotten nails, it leaned, not with charm, but with a kind of tired surrender, as though it no longer cared whether it stood or fell. The beams were warped. The door swung freely on one hinge. And underneath, always underneath, the slow sound of water moving past, carrying things you didn't want to think about. It wasn't a place you visited willingly. It was a place you went when your body gave you no choice. And in winter, it was cruel. The cold met you the moment you opened the door. Not just air, but a slap of wet, icy wind that rushed up through the floorboards, announcing itself with every breath. Inside, it was dark. Even during the day, there was no window. Only a small slit where two planks had once meant to meet, but never quite had. Through that crack, you could see the world. Trees bent with frost, water sliding over rocks, clouds that never seemed to part, but the view offered no comfort. Not here. The seat was just a hole cut into a board. Splinters waited for the careless. There was no cushion, no privacy, no dignity. Just the sharp scent of rot and ammonia, and the quiet knowledge that others had sat here before you, and others would come after. Still, it was yours, for a moment. A pause in the day's labor. A minute to yourself, even if the air bit your skin and the floor creaked like it might give way. Even here, the world demanded patience. You wrapped your arms around yourself, squatted quickly, and prayed to be. Done fast that you learn tricks. How to brace your boots so you didn't slide. How to breathe through your mouth, but not too deeply. How to knock first to check if someone was already inside. The door had no lock, only a loose rope looped around. A nail. It offered more suggestion than security dots sometimes. When it rained, the river rose and the smell intensified. The water kissed the base of the structure, and the floor felt suddenly much thinner. You'd imagine the whole thing washing away, not with drama, but with a soft, resigned float. You, gone with it. In summer, wasps came. They liked the corners, the warmth, the smells. You learned to wave them off gently. Violence only made things worse. And yet, this too was part of life. Of every life in that village. No matter how clean your apron or how proud your gait, you would find yourself here. In the outhouse over, the river, humbled, alone, cold. Children feared it. Elders cursed it. Visitors avoided it. But still it stood, year after year, through frost, flood, rot, and wind, because someone had built it once, not out of pride, but out of need. And no, one had the time or tools to make it better. Sometimes, while squatting, your eyes wandered to the trees, the clouds, the current. The water below didn't judge. It just moved, quietly carrying everything away. Waste, rain, leaves, thoughts. If you listened, really listened, you could hear the layers of life in the wood. The echoes of generations who'd sat in silence here. Maybe a girl who cried after being struck. A man who sighed too deeply. A child who hummed a song into the gloom. It was a place of release in more ways than one. And when you left quickly, always quickly, you stepped back into the world with a strange kind of relief. The sun felt warmer. The chores felt lighter. Even the cold wind seemed more bearable. You had survived it again. There was no glory in this place. No history book would mark its existence. But it mattered, because it reminded you daily that no one was above the basics. That even in a world of lords and legends, everyone squatted somewhere. And so the outhouse stood, half crooked, half forgotten. A place where dignity waited outside, and humanity, raw and unvarnished, sat in the dark with its knees tucked in. There were times when the ground no longer stayed where it should, when the path to the well became a stream, when the garden gave up its shape and sank into something shapeless. Flood season didn't arrive with thunder or fury. It arrived with a squelch beneath the foot, a slow seep into the seams of the world, and the heavy, silent sigh of people who'd seen it before. The home was not raised. It couldn't afford to be. Its floor was the earth itself. No stone, no boards, only soil worn smooth by footsteps and packed firm by years of living on it. In flood season, that earth remembered it had once been part of a riverbed. Water returned to it, slowly, cruelly, with a quiet that felt personal. At first, it was just damp toes in the morning, and puddles that never quite dried. Then socks, hung too close to the fire, steamed instead of warmed. And then the straw bed turned heavy. Dampness doesn't sleep, it clings. And once it had crept in, it never truly left. You learned to move differently. Softly, carefully, the ground shifted. Buckets tilted. Cracks widened. Furniture had to be lifted onto stones, not because it was valuable, but because even the leg of a stool deserved to stay dry if it could. Clothes took on a permanent smell, of mildew and hearth smoke, of wool refusing to dry. Mold formed on things you didn't even know could mold. Leather belts, wooden bowls, the edges of pages in the family psalter. And yet, there was no choice. You couldn't leave. There was nowhere else to go. Shoes sat by the fire at night, not in hope of drying, but in hope of being warm enough to slip on in the morning. You wrapped your feet in rags. You padded them with moss, You waited for the thaw that never quite arrived. Children grew sick. Coughs echoed off damp walls. But still, life moved on, not gracefully, but stubbornly. Bread was still baked, though it took longer. Fires were still lit, though the wood smoked more than it burned. Chickens still laid, though their feathers never dried. The rain was not always falling. Sometimes it paused, as if to let you believe in reprieve, but the ground stayed wet. It held on to the flood like a grudge. And every time you stepped outside, the weight of your foot reminded you how deep the water had gone. There were moments, even in this, that shimmered. A child's laughter as they chased a frog into the house. A sparkle of candlelight reflected. In puddles on the floor. The strange, soft hush that blanketed the world when everything ground roof. Sky was soaked in the same silence. Neighbors helped where they could. A plank placed between doors. A shared loaf. A dry place to sit. For an hour. But mostly it was endured alone. With teeth clenched, socks wrung, and spirits dried more than the walls. When the water rose too high, people would sleep standing, leaning against the hearth, arms folded, eyes closed. You'd think rest couldn't come that way, but exhaustion finds cracks even in bodies, and still they held on. Because they always had. Because giving up wasn't as simple as it sounded. Because the garden would dry again. The sun would come again. The roof would hold, maybe not well, but well enough. There was a poetry to the suffering. Not the kind that made it beautiful, but the kind that made it bearable. The rhythm of dripping water, the soft thud of a pail, the crackling groan of damp wood trying to remember what dryness felt like. In the dark, under covers that were more wet than warm, people whispered stories. Of summers with too much sun, of winters with too little snow, of springs when the flowers fought their way up through the mud, bold and ridiculous. And then, one morning, it stopped. The rain paused. The puddles shrank. The smell changed. From mold to morning. Shoes were put outside, in the sun. Blankets hung over fences. The home was still soaked, still sagging, still shivering. But something had shifted. Not just the weather. The people, too. They smiled more easily, even at nothing. Because nothing felt like a gift. And for a few short weeks, until the clouds returned, life lifted its head and stretched. And then, one morning, it stopped. The rain paused. The puddles shrank. The smell changed. From mold to morning. Shoes were put outside, in the sun. Blankets hung over fences. The home was still soaked, still sagging, still shivering. But something had shifted. Not just the weather. The people, too. They smiled more easily, even at nothing. Because nothing felt like a gift. And for a few short weeks, until the clouds returned, life lifted its head and stretched. But they never forgot. Flood season wasn't a visitor. It was a relative. One that left quietly and returned uninvited. And each time it came back, it took a little more. A beam, a boot, a breath. Still, they stayed. Still, they lived. Because even in the soggiest corners of the world, people build lives. And they build them stubbornly. Some people lived in one place all their lives. They built their fires in the same hearths, laid their heads on the same straw, and watched the seasons turn from the same small doorway. But not the peddler. The peddler wandered. Not because he was lost, but because movement was the only kind of belonging he understood. With a pack on his back and hope stitched into the soles of his worn boots, he went from village to village, road to road, carrying a little bit of everything and almost nothing that was his. By day, he was company. People came to his blanket, or barrow with coins and questions, needles, soap, ribbon, salt, a comb, a button. They saw his wares and forgot, for a moment, how tired their own lives were. He brought news, jokes, a song or two. He was welcomed until sundown. At night, he was no one's guest. The village might take his goods, but it rarely offered a bed. Sometimes a barn, if he was lucky. Sometimes the corner of a shed with a leaking roof and a pile of old turnips. For company, more often, the earth. A patch of grass if it hadn't rained. A hollow near a tree. A soft shoulder of road where he could rest just long enough to rise aching again. He had a blanket, and it itched. Not from age, though it was ancient, but from life. Fleas, mites, the kind of tiny, determined creatures that claimed every traveler as their host. No matter how many times he beat the cloth against a tree or laid it out in the sun, they returned. It was their home too. So he slept in it, itchy, restless, one eye open, one hand always near his pouch. Sometimes he dreamed of soft pillows, but more often he dreamed of dry grass, a full belly, and silence. Not the kind of silence that came from fear, but the kind that held peace. The silence of a fire burning low, of a world paused. The fire, when he could build one, was small, a flicker between stones. He had no hearth, only his hands, and they weren't always steady. Wet kindling, wind, and hunger made the task longer some nights, but he was patient. A peddler had to be. He'd eat bread so hard to chip teeth if he wasn't careful. Cheese with more character than taste. Dried bits of this and that, chewed slowly while he watched the trees breathe in darkness. Meals were not about flavor. They were about staying upright for one more mile. If rain came, he found the driest place he could, usually not very dry at all, and hunched beneath his blanket, nose tucked in, pretending he couldn't smell the mildew. He waited, like the trees did, like the road itself did, for the clouds to pass. His possessions were few but precious. A knife, a threadbare scarf, a coin with a hole in it that brought luck on hard days, a whistle, though he hadn't played it in years, and of course, the bundle of goods, carefully wrapped, tied, protected like a child. He never stayed long. Anywhere, a few hours, a day, maybe two, if the weather was cruel or the road ahead whispered danger. But the next morning, he'd be gone. Long before the village woke, long before anyone noticed. He walked alone, but he wasn't lonely. Not always. The road had a rhythm. Birds greeted him. Trees bent just so. Stones remembered his tread. He passed the same worn milestones, the same patches of moss. The world, in its quiet way, knew him. Still, at night, when the stars peeked out and the cold crept in, the world didn't hold him close. He shivered. He scratched. He dreamed of stillness. He wasn't young. Not anymore. His knees had begun to grumble. His back spoke in sharp syllables. And each morning, it took longer to feel like himself again. But stopping? That was harder than moving. Because where would he stop? He had no door of his own. No bed that remembered his shape. No one waiting with soup and a smile. Sometimes, when he passed a house with light in the window, he'd pause. Just a second. Long enough to feel the warmth brush his face from afar. Then he'd move on. The itchy blanket never stopped itching. But he'd grown used to it. It was his comfort and his curse. Like the road. Like the life he carried with him. And so he slept. On damp earth. Under stars. With creatures in his cloak and dreams stitched into his pack. He slept not because he was tired, though he was, but because sleep was the only constant. Morning came like it always did, not with fanfare. Just light, creeping across his face. He sat up, groaned softly, rubbed the sleep from his beard, shook the blanket, scratched Dot, and walked on. Some villages had bells, some had bridges. This one had a gallows. It stood on a hill just beyond the last row of cottages, leaning slightly west, where the wind never stopped moving. The wood was gray from weather and time. The rope swayed even when no one was watching. It had not always been there, but for most living memory, it had. A quiet companion to every harvest, every marriage, every funeral. Children were told not to stare, but they did. How could they not? The gallows was the tallest thing around, taller than the church spire, taller than the old oak in the square. Its shadow fell differently each day, sometimes pointing toward the well, sometimes toward the inn. It never pointed nowhere got. No one spoke of it during the day. But at night, in hushed tones by the hearth, it came up. Not the events, not the hangings, just the presence, the knowledge, that reminder. A piece of justice or warning or memory, depending on who you asked. The rope was changed often, not because it wore out, but because it absorbed too much. Rain, yes, but also breath, whispers, things that could not be named without bringing them back. Houses nearby never sold for much. Too close, too quiet, too many windows that faced the hill. And yet, people lived there. They had to. And after a while, they got used to the shape on the skyline. Like a crooked tree or a steeple built by tired hands out in the mornings, the fog clung to it first. It wrapped the beam, the noose, the post, like it was being dressed in silence. Birds perched on the crossbeam, never for long. Even they knew better. The baker's son said he saw it sway once when there was no wind. The blacksmith said it creaked on the night his father died. The priest, though, said nothing at all. Not ever. His house faced away from the hill. Washing lines near the edge of the village fluttered nervously. Laundry didn't dry as well there. Or maybe that was just the story people told to explain why they never walked too close. And yet, life continued. Chickens scratched the earth. Fires were lit. Bread was baked. Laughter still happened, carefully, like it didn't want to wake something. There was a woman, old as stories, who lived in the last house before the path to the gallows began. She said the wind whispered names sometimes. But when asked which names, she would only say, none you'd want to carry. The children dared each other to touch the base, to run up the hill and back before the bell tower finished a chime. Most never made it. One boy did, and never smiled the same again. No one knew what he saw, or if he saw anything, but he wouldn't sleep with the window open after that. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below, and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. The gallows was empty more often than not, but it was never forgotten. It didn't need a body to be powerful. It was a memory made of wood and sky. People passing through rarely lingered. Some made the sign of the cross. Others muttered and moved on. Travelers who stayed too long asked questions and left with fewer answers than they came with. But for those who lived there, it was just part of the landscape, as natural and as unnatural as breathing. They didn't look up when they walked past it. They didn't speak its name during supper. But they knew it was there, always there, waiting for someone to remember too loudly. And sometimes once every year or two, it was used not with ceremony. Not anymore, just with a whisper, a cart, a nail, a rope, a silence. And then the long walk back down the hill. The next morning, it would be empty again, but different, and the village would return to its rhythms. Children would play. Bread would rise. Windows would fog. And the gallows would keep its vigil, patient and tall. They never tore it down, even after generations passed, even when the law no longer demanded it, because taking it down would be louder than leaving it. The hill would still be there. The wind, too, and better a familiar shadow than the memory of one. And so the village lived beside the gallows, beneath its shadow, within its silence. They lived fully, carefully, and they watched the rope, Dot, just in case, Dot, it was not a prison, though it might have looked like one. Stone walls, a narrow slit of a window, a door that groaned on rusted hinges and closed with the sound of finality. No bars, but no freedom either. Not the kind that stretched across fields or danced at festivals, Dot. This was a monastic cell. And here, silence was king. The monk who lived in it did not decorate. There was no room for beauty, and even less for vanity. His bed was a board, softened only by the wear of years. No straw, no cushion, just a woolen blanket folded with the precision of habit, its corners always aligned with the edge of the frame. The room smelled of old wood, faint incense, and time. Not mold, not quite, but the memory of dampness that never left completely. One candle, one cup, one bowl, one robe, the sum of his possessions, and more than he allowed himself to. Desire. The walls were thick, meant to hold out noise and keep in thought. Sometimes they held in loneliness, too. But no one said that out loud. Loneliness was to be embraced, not escaped. It was part of the vow. Dot. He woke before the sun. Not to the sound of birds, but to the cold. A kind of cold that seeped into the bones while they slept, then clung like a second robe. He lit no fire. Fires were for kitchens, and warmth was a temptation. Instead, he whispered a prayer and wrapped his arms tighter across his chest. There was no mirror. His reflection lived only in memory, and even that began to fade over time. What mattered was the inner world, the soul, the discipline, the hunger for grace, not food. Meals were taken in silence, eaten slowly, spoon by spoon. Broth, dark bread, sometimes cheese. Enough to keep the body working, never enough to let it forget its purpose. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing only if it feels right. The cell was both sanctuary and challenge. In its quiet corners, temptation echoed louder. A remembered touch, a warm hearth once known, the scent of honey, the laughter of a child in another life. These were the thoughts he was meant to release, to watch rise like incense and disappear. But they lingered. He wrote, sometimes, carefully. Ink was precious, each letter born of breath, shaped with patience. Scripture, reflection, the small, trembling truths that came only when the world had been muted long enough to hear them. Outside, the world moved without him. Seasons changed. Trees budded, bloomed, burned, and broke. He watched them through his window, not with longing, but with rhythm. Everything had its time. His was here. Visitors were rare. A superior now and then. A novice trembling with questions. A sick brother sent to rest. Their voices felt strange, sharp against the smooth silence he'd learned to carry. He listened more than he spoke, not because he was wise, but because words, once spent, could not be gathered back. At night, the cell grew colder still. The candle flickered, then died. He lay flat on the board, hands folded across his chest. Sleep came as a gift, not a guarantee. He dreamt of nothing, or so he told himself. In truth, sometimes he dreamt of rivers, or horses, or the weight of another body beside his. But these he forgot by dawn. His life was not measured in milestones. No births, no weddings, no promotions. Only prayers, only fasts, only the slow, wearing away of the self in pursuit of something higher. And yet he smiled, softly, when the breeze carried in the scent of rain, when a sparrow landed on his sill, then tilted its head, when a fellow brother sang a note so pure it hung in the air like glass. He did not seek joy, but when it arrived, uninvited and quiet, he let it stay. There was dignity in his stillness. Not pride, but purpose. Not status, but steadiness. He lived not to be remembered, but to remember what others forgot. Gratitude, stillness, the sacred. In the smallest things, a sliver of light through a crack in the stone, a syllable whispered in the dark, the final flicker of a candle's breath. This was his life, one of absence shaped into meaning, a silence full of sound, a hunger full of peace. And every night, as he lay with eyes closed and hands still, the wind moved through the window and touched his face like a blessing. The house was small, a single room, perhaps two. The roof sagged a little more each season, like it was tired of holding up the sky. Its shutters had long since fallen away, and the door was barred from the outside with a beam of cracked wood, not nailed, just wedged firmly, finally, and long ago that no one lived there anymore. But once they had, the plague had come like a whisper. First, a child with a fever, a cough that wouldn't go, a dark swelling beneath the arm, then a mother, then a brother, then a neighbor who had only come to borrow onions. When it was clear what had entered the home, the village did what it had, learned to do quietly, sorrowfully, without ceremony. They sealed it, locked the door, moved on. Inside, time stopped. The fire, if there was one, had burned out. The food was left on the table, uneaten. A pot of something, congealed now. A chair tipped slightly back, as if someone had risen too fast. A child's shoe near the door, never tied. No one ever reopened it. No one retrieved the bodies. No one dared. To do so was to invite death in, to unseal what had been carefully contained. So it remained intact, but abandoned, silent but screaming. To those who passed too close, grass grew high around it. Vines curled into the eaves. In winter, snow layered on the roof in still perfection. In spring, birds landed briefly on the ledge, but never built their nests there. They said the plague couldn't last on wood, that over time, the sickness died with the ones it took. But no one tested the truth of that. The house remained untouched, not out of fear anymore, but out of respect. A kind of reverence for the silence that dwelled there. Children were told stories of the woman who sang lullabies through the door, even when no one answered. Of the man who whispered prayers until his voice cracked like dry bark. Of the dog who waited outside for days before vanishing into the woods. Even the wind seemed to shift near it quieter, slower, unwilling to disturb the dust inside. The house did not rot quickly. It endured, held together by memory as much as by wood. A tomb built by time, not design. There were moments just before dawn, or when the fog was thick, when some said they saw flickers inside. A glow, a shape, the movement of someone still living the last day, again and again. But these were stories, and stories are a kind of blanket we wrap around fear. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below, and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. The village never spoke of the family by name. Names gave shape, and shape gave weight. Instead, they said, the plague house, like it had always been that, as though its life before sickness had been erased. And yet, sometimes, when a child went missing, or a dog barked too long, someone would glance toward the hill where it stood, and wonder not with belief, but with the ache of not knowing. What did they feel in those final hours? What did they say to each other when the door was sealed? Did they cry out? Did they accept? Did they sit close, hands clasped, waiting for something gentler than fate? No one would ever know, and perhaps that was mercy, because the house became more than walls. It became a warning, a memory carved in wood, a marker of the time when silence became survival. Taught the village to listen, to the cough behind a curtain, the stillness behind a smile, the way fear moved not with shouts, but with shivers. It stood long after the sickness left the land, after new babies were born, after old trees fell, after roads were rebuilt. It stood because some houses are too full of history to fall easily. And eventually, it stopped being a plague house. It just became the house on the hill, near the bend, where no one went, but everyone remembered. And in remembering, they kept it standing, because forgetting would be worse. It was built to be high, to see farther than a man could climb, stone upon stone, spiraling into a sky that rarely stayed still. A watchtower, perched on the edge of a cliff that forgot where the land ended and the air began. It was not beautiful. It was useful. And like many things built for utility, it had no softness in it. The walls were thick, the stairwell narrow, the windows just slits enough to let in light, but never warmth. The guard who lived there lived alone. Always. It was not a post given to the noble or the strong, but to the spare. A second son, a punished soldier, a man whose silence made others uncomfortable. Someone needed to be up high after all. Someone had to keep watch. There was a cot in the corner, a stool near the wall, and a fireplace that never worked as well as it should. The wind came down the chimney like a voice with bad intentions, howling, laughing, sometimes moaning. The fire hissed, fought, then gave up. He wore his cloak to sleep. Boots, too, on the worst nights. Fingers wrapped in cloth. You didn't undress here. You layered. Food came twice a week, if the weather allowed. A boy with a mule climbed the winding path, left a sack by the door, and climbed back down without. Looking back, they never spoke. The wind ate their words. The tower shook sometimes. Not enough to break, but enough to remind you that stone is not immune to time. A creak here, a groan there. You learned the difference between harmless noises and the ones that meant trouble. You saw the world from up there, but not in a way that felt freeing. Fields looked like patchwork, trees like bristles, people like insects, until they vanished into distance. You didn't wave. No one waved back, but the stars were clearer. That was the gift. On nights when the sky was still, and the moon not too proud, they filled the darkness with pinpricks of silence. He would sit by the ledge, cloak pulled tight, and stare for hours. He never named them. He wasn't a man of learning, but he knew them by shape, by feel, by the comfort they offered that fire could not. When storms came, they came angry. The tower would hum with tension. Wind slammed against the stone like fists. Rain came in sideways, and the guard would brace himself in the stairwell, one hand on the wall, the other clutching the iron ring, near his cot, just in case. There were no visitors, only crows. They liked the battlements. They watched him with the same stillness he offered the world. Sometimes he spoke to them, just to hear a voice in the air. If he fell ill, there was no medicine. If he cried out, there was no one to answer. The isolation wasn't cruel. It was just there, like the wind, like the stone, like the tower itself. He kept records in chalk, marks on the wall for storms, for sunrises, for anything unusual. No one asked him to, but he liked the rhythm. It made the silence into a pattern. Sometimes a rider would appear in the distance. He'd watch the figure rise from a blur into a shape, and if it bore a banner, he'd signal with smoke. If it bore none, he waited and watched. He did his job, diligently, quietly, without thanks. The safety of the village below depended on eyes like his, tired, unblinking, always facing the horizon. But no one ever thanked the tower. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below, and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. He grew older, not noticeably at first, but the steps grew steeper, the wind colder, the nights longer, he didn't complain. There was no one to hear it anyway. And then one winter, he didn't come down. The boy brought food, waited, knocked. Nothing. He left the sack. Came again 2 days later. Still nothing. When they climbed the tower, they found him in the chair by the window, cloak wrapped tight, eyes closed, as though watching one last night settle over the hills. They buried him in the earth near the base. Not much ceremony. Just a stone with no name. But the villagers still look up at the tower sometimes, and they wonder, is someone still watching? And maybe, in a way, someone is, because the wind still moves through the stones. The crows still perch on the ledge, and the stars still shine, just the same as they did when he stared up at them with tired eyes and a quiet heart. The tower stands, alone, steady, listening. They called it the quiet wing, a gentle phrase like a folded napkin or a whispered prayer. But it was more than quiet. It was hushed, held in the kind of silence that gathers only where sorrow has lingered long enough to settle into the stones. The abbey rose with grace, carved arches, stained glass, a bell that spoke at regular intervals. People entered it for comfort, for penance, for belonging. But not all who entered did so by choice. The orphans lived in the far corner, not out of malice. The nuns would never say so, but out of practicality. They needed space. The children needed care. And there was a room at the end of a long hall where the voices of the abbey rarely reached. The room was long, low-ceilinged, lit by a single, narrow window too high for even the oldest child to reach. The beds were lined in a row, not straw, piles, but wooden frames with thin mattresses stuffed with wool and stitched shut by trembling hands. Each bed identical, each one just far enough from the next to remind the sleeper they were alone. There were no toys, only objects that might pass for such. A smooth rock, a bit of twine, a doll made from bundled rags. These were treasures held close at night, guarded with a quiet that even the youngest understood was necessary. The nuns were not cruel, just tired. Their kindness came in glances, in the way they smoothed a child's hair during prayers, or passed an extra slice of bread beneath the table. Discipline was soft but unyielding, rules enforced with the rhythm of routine. Meals, chores, prayers, silence, sleep. Names faded. Children arrived with them and left with numbers. Not officially, but quietly, in the way one stopped being Mara and became the quiet girl by the fire. Or Thomas, now simply the one who cries in sleep. They did not ask whether parents had gone. They knew. Illness, war, fire, famine. The great sweep of things that took without asking. And the abbey, for all its cold corners, was a place where they were not alone. At night, they whispered. When the sisters had gone, and the candle had been snuffed, the room filled with stories. Some real, some imagined. A brother once met the Virgin in the cloister. A girl dreamed of her mother's bread. A shadow on the wall had teeth, but it never bit. The stories kept them company. They stitched one night to the next. One child would. Always the same tune. No one knew the words. Perhaps there were none. Just a rise and fall, like breathing. A thread of sound in the dark, weaving them together without ever touching. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below, and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. Their chores were small. Sweeping, peeling, scrubbing. They worked with hands too small for the tasks, but they did them anyway. And in return, they were fed, clothed, given a place to sleep where the roof didn't leak, and the wind knocked politely. But there was still cold. In the floor, in the beds, in the places where no fire could reach. They shared warmth when they could. 2 pairs of feet under one blanket. A hand held beneath folded sheets. Not out of affection, out of need. Some were adopted. A rare event, but it happened. The chosen child would be bathed, brushed, dressed in something finer. They would wait by the abbey gate, eyes wide, heart louder than the bell. And then they would vanish, taken by strangers who promised to feed and care and love. Some came back, years later, different, taller, eyes a little harder. They brought coins or food or stories. They never stayed long. The abbey wasn't home, just a beginning. They didn't like to speak of. Others never left. They became sisters, took vows, wore habits and pressed hands to chests in solemn promise. They learned to pray more than they spoke. They learned to care for those who came after. And in time, they stopped remembering which bed had been theirs. But for those still in the corner, still waking to bells and sleeping to whispers, the abbey was a world. Narrow, yes, repetitive, stern, but also safe in its way. The window high on the wall showed sky, just a sliver, enough to know if it was raining, enough to see stars if you stood on the edge of your bed and craned your neck, enough to dream. And dreams here were important. They filled the cracks. They softened the walls. They gave color to a life that had, for many, started in shadow. There was laughter, too. Quiet, hidden, but real. A joke during chores. A slip on the icy stone steps. A small rebellion. A tongue stuck out behind a sister's back. These things mattered. They stitched joy into gray fabric. In time, the children grew. New ones came. The room stayed the same. The beds unchanged. The corner held their breath, their tears, their hopes. And the abbey watched. From stained glass eyes. From bells that rang no matter who listened. From the wind that moved through the cloisters like a memory. The orphan's corner was not lovely, but it was theirs. Above. The city never slept. Hooves on cobblestone, market bells, the bark of cellars, the cries of newborns and drunkards. Life poured out of every door, every window, every overflowing street. It pressed against the walls, loud and unrelenting. But below was a different world entirely. Beneath the stone and sewage and sandals of the city lived the tunnels. Not sewers exactly, though they smelled of old water and rot. Not catacombs, though bones were not unheard of. They were something in between, a forgotten anatomy of a living city, carved by hands long since dust, and walked now only by those who had no better place to go. There was no map, only memory, turns remembered by the shape of the stones, markings scraped into walls, a left turn at the arch where the roots broke through, a right past the dripping ceiling where a rat once drowned. It was not dry, never dry. Even in summer, the floor was damp. Even in drought, the air tasted of mildew. The tunnels breathed a different breath than the city above. Thick, stale, and unhurried. Those who lived down here did so quietly. People who had slipped through cracks, criminals. Runaways, widows who owed too much. Boys with no last name. Women who had stopped speaking years ago. They didn't introduce themselves. They simply nodded. A kind of recognition passed between those who shared the same shade of dark. No one came here for comfort. But there was a kind of safety in the silence. The city above forgot things easily. Below, memory clung like moss. There were chambers carved into the walls, sleeping hollows barely large enough for a curled body. Straw bedding, sometimes, a piece of cloth, a stolen pillow. A boot stuffed with rags became a headrest. They slept in pairs when they could, for warmth, but never with trust. Trust was a currency few could afford. Fire was a luxury. It drew attention. Smoke had a way of finding its way up, so they burned tallow in shells, and sometimes fat-soaked string in clay balls. The light was orange and sad. It moved like it was tired of being alive. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. Food came from the market above, dropped, forgotten, or stolen. A bruised apple, a torn loaf, soup that had cooled too long in a tavern corner. They shared it with ceremony. A circle, a muttered joke, a nod of thanks too soft to hear. The sound of the city filtered down, muffled, warped, sometimes laughter, sometimes bells, sometimes screams. It was like listening to life from beneath a river. You knew it was happening, but it never touched you. There were dangers, of course, collapses, floods. The city didn't care what weight it put on the world beneath. A broken pipe, a heavy cart, a careless fire. The tunnel walls were not built with eternity in mind, and there were others. Men with no law above and even less below. Thieves who preyed on the desperate. Guards who chased shadows into the dark, then decided not to return. The tunnels remembered them all. You could feel it in the walls, the way they closed in tighter in certain places, the way the air shifted, warning you away. Children were rare, but they existed, born in silence, raised in shadows. Their first words were whispers. Their first toys were stones and soot. They learned not to cry. Crying echoed, and echoes brought trouble. Some days the tunnels were still. Only the drip of water, the scurry of claws, a shuffle of feet with nowhere else to go. Other days they became veins, pulsing with hurried feet, with messages, with secrets not meant to surface. Some carried candles like saints, some carried knives. Everyone carried memory. There was a man who etched poems into the walls. No one knew his name, but the verses were there, scratched low, near where the light barely reached. About rain, about loss, about a girl who once laughed when the sun hit her teeth. No one asked questions. But sometimes, before sleep, someone would run their fingers across his words, like a blessing. And then, of course, there were the exits. Narrow, hidden, precious. A stone that shifted. A plank that lifted. A grate loose enough to slip through. Every tunnel dweller had a favorite. A place where they could rise for a moment. Steal light. Breathe air that hadn't passed through 3 layers of rot. But they always returned. Because the city above had rules, and the tunnels did not. Above, you had to be someone. Below, you just had to endure. And so they did in corners. In damp. In dark. In dreams. Because even in the places furthest from light, people find ways to live. It leaned against the side of another house, as though it had grown tired of standing on its own. A few wooden boards, patched with canvas and rope, pressed together, like mismatched puzzle pieces. The roof sagged under its own age, and the walls wavered in the wind, creaking softly, like bones shifting in sleep. This was the widow's lean dash to not a house, not even a hut, just a structure shaped enough like shelter to fool the wind. It had no door, only a curtain made from an old sack, nailed above with bent iron scraps. It lifted with every breeze, revealing the shape of someone who had learned, long ago, not to shiver. The widow had once lived elsewhere, in a home with stone corners, bread on the table, and voices in the next room. But war or plague, or something just as silent and just as cruel, had taken all that. One loss at a time, until only she remained. And even she didn't speak of how she moved into the lean-to, not out of choice, but out of absence. There was nowhere else. And so she built it, piece by piece, with hands that trembled less from age than from effort. It wasn't strong, but it stood. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't the wind inside. Everything was arranged by necessity. A low cot made from 2 crates and a splintered plank. A blanket, rough as bark, folded and refolded every morning like a ritual. A fire pit, just a ring of stones, where she burned twigs and sometimes paper. When wood was scarce, she cooked in a tin bowl with no handle. The broth was thin, mostly water, a root or two, and the memory of better meals. She sipped slowly, as if each spoonful might be the last, not because she feared death, but because she had learned how precious even a bad supper could be. Her hands were always busy, stitching, wrapping, braiding twine. The motions weren't for work anymore. They were for warmth, for comfort, for the illusion of purpose in a place where time moved slowly, but never backwards. The snow came early that year. It fell in slow spirals, soft at first, then harder, until it covered everything, even the holes in the canvas roof. She patched them with old linen and prayer. The cold slipped through anyway. At night, she pressed her feet against a stone she'd warmed in the fire. It lost its heat quickly, but not before she fell asleep. She wore her coat to bed, a thick wool thing that had once been her husband's. Too big now. But then again, everything was too big now. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video, and consider subscribing only if it feels right. She did not speak often, but the villagers knew her. They left scraps, a heel of bread on the stoop, a turnip too bruised to sell. Once, a child left a candle, already burned halfway. She lit it on the darkest nights and watched the shadows move across the wooden planks like visitors. She prayed, but not aloud. Her prayers were movements, habits, whispers in the steam rising from her cup. They were stitched into the seams of her blanket, brushed into her hair, with a comb missing half its teeth. Some nights she dreamt of her husband's voice. Not the words, just the sound of it. Low, kind, certain. Other nights she heard the sound of laughter that might have been her own once, long ago. The wind grew crueler in January. It found its way through every gap, every seam. Her joints ached, her breath puffed in clouds. But still, she sat by the fire pit, wrapping thread, boiling broth, rocking slightly, as if to a lullaby no one else could hear. And then, one morning, it was colder than usual. A silence deeper than snowfall. A neighbor came to check, a small loaf in her hands. The curtain did not lift inside. The fire was out. The stone had long since gone cold. But the widow was still, peaceful, her hands folded neatly, her coat drawn high, her head turned toward the crack in the wall where the first light of dawn crept in. She had died as she had lived, quietly, with dignity carved for nothing, with warmth made from memory. They buried her beneath the large elm just beyond the village, where the wind was softer and the sun stayed longer. The lean-to remained for a time. No one moved in. No one touched. It stood like a page left open, waiting for someone to read what had been lived there. Eventually, the wind took it apart, board by board, piece by piece, until only a patch of flattened grass remained, and the smell of smoke that lingered longer than it should have. But some nights, when the snow falls quietly, and the sky turns the color of ash, the villagers still pause, and they remember the woman who lived in the lean-to, who never asked for much, who gave nothing but example, and who endured the winter with more strength than most could see. It was not on any map, not marked with symbols or spoken of in taverns. The path to it wasn't really a path at all, just a vague series of decisions, left at the twisted birch, past the hollow tree, through the ferns that whispered too loudly when the wind moved. If you found it, you weren't supposed to. And once you did, you rarely found it again. The forest was old, not in years, but in knowing. It held the silence of things that had watched too much and decided never to speak of it. And somewhere deep within it, nestled where the sunlight filtered like dust through water, sat the hut. It was made of what the forest gave: bark, branches, moss stuffed between planks to keep the cold from becoming a guest. Its roof sagged in the middle, as if it sighed with the weight of being forgotten. A chimney jutted from one side, crooked and barely used. Smoke rose from it sometimes, but not often, and never for long. No road led to its door. No footsteps disturbed the soft carpet of leaves outside. No voices called in greeting. No knocks echoed on the crooked frame. The hut sat in stillness, untouched, unnoticed, and entirely alone. Someone lived there, or had, or still did. It was hard to tell. Inside. It was one room. A hearth in the center, low flames occasionally crackling beneath a blackened pot. A cot against the wall, fur thrown over it, deer, perhaps, or something older. Shelves lined with jars filled with herbs, dust, feathers, odd bits of bone. The air smelled of thyme, wood smoke, and a sweetness that had no name. It wasn't unpleasant, just unfamiliar, like the breath of something that didn't visit towns, didn't trade in coins or conversation. No one spoke of the inhabitant directly. In the village nearest the edge of the woods, people avoided the topic like a sore tooth. They said little, but their silences were loud. Children were told not to wander. Hunters turned back when the mist grew thick. And if someone did go missing for a day or two, no one said where they might have gone. There were stories, of course. There always are. A woman with silver hair who spoke to birds. A man with hands that glowed in moonlight. A figure who could heal or harm, depending on how the wind blew and whether you used their true name. But those were stories told from porches in summer, where fear became entertainment and truth was optional. In winter, those stories stopped, as if the cold made them real again. If someone lived in the hut, and surely someone did, they didn't ask for much. They never appeared in the market, never sent messages, never asked for salt or bread. And yet, the hut remained stocked. Someone gathered the wood. Someone stirred the fire. Someone whispered to the forest, and the forest, it seemed, whispered back. Some claimed they'd seen her, or him, or it, a shape in the trees, a song in a language that tasted like sap, eyes in the dark that didn't blink, only watched, calm as moonlight, but no one ever got close. The hut kept its distance, and those who tried to close it were turned around by roots that weren't there before, or fog that didn't lift, or the sudden, certain feeling that they weren't meant to continue. And so it stayed, untouched. Still. Waiting for nothing, needing no one. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below, and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. The idea of it was enough. A place where someone lived apart, not out of pride, not out of fear, but out of a need to be quiet in a world that had grown too loud. The roof leaked sometimes, but someone patched it. The fire died, but someone lit it again. A spoon sat on the table, carved from ash, worn smooth at the handle. Next to it, a cup, chipped but clean. These things were used, cared for, touched by hands that had grown used to stillness. A mirror hung near the door, not for vanity, but for watching. And on the windowsill, a line of stones, flat, round, placed with care, not for decoration, for memory, perhaps, or protection. The forest around it never grew too wild, never claimed the hut the way it claimed other things. The trees kept their distance. The animals kept quiet, as though the hut had earned its place, not by force, but by time. Some say the inhabitant was once part of the village, a healer maybe, or someone who saw something they shouldn't have. Others say they were never one of us to begin with, born beneath an eclipse, or found in a cradle made of reeds, already watching with eyes too old. The truth doesn't matter. What matters is the stillness. the quiet dignity of a life lived far from eyes, but close to the heart of things. Because somewhere, even now, as you listen, the hut is still there, tucked in the greenest part of the woods, beneath branches that bend but don't break, breathing smoke into the sky, keeping its secrets, and waiting for no one doubt it was meant to be a place of rhythm, of turning wheels and falling grain, of creaking beams and flour floating like breath in the air. But the river changed, and the rhythm stopped. The mill sat slanted now, leaning toward the water like it wanted to remember how it used to move. Its wheel, once a proud thing wide and dark with yews, was cracked through the middle, its paddles broken like teeth. It dipped into the water out of habit, not function, lifting only moss and silence. They still called it the mill, because no one had the heart to call it a ruin. It had stood too long, served too many, fed too many children with loaves made from its flour, to lose its name completely. But everyone knew it didn't grind anymore. Not really. Not well. The river had shifted course, just slightly, but enough. A slow erosion upstream, a buildup of rock where the channel once ran deep. The flow weakened, then scattered. What once churned with power now trickled through weeds, and the wheel sighed more than it spun. Inside, dust had taken the place of grain. Sacks, once full, now slumped against the wall, stitched with patches, but sagging with disappointment. The grinding stones, long since dulled, sat unused. One leaned against the other, as if to rest. Tired of the centuries' doubt, the miller still lived there. He didn't leave not out of stubbornness, but because leaving meant naming the loss. So he stayed, with boots older than most men's memories, and a coat he never removed, even when the fire was lit. His days were quiet now. He rose before the sun, as always, out of rhythm more than purpose. He fed the hens who refused to lay. He swept a floor that no longer collected flour. He touched the wheel with a reverence that once belonged to saints. He would pour a little water into the groove where the river used to run fastest, watching it curl and vanish into the soil. A ritual, almost. A stubborn hope. A whisper to the past. The village sent him grain from time to time. Out of kindness, he would grind it by hand slowly with the old stone mortar in the corner. Not much, just enough for a loaf or two. He baked them on the hearthstone, wrapped them in cloth, and left them at the edge of town. No one ever said thank you, but someone always took the bread. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below, and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. In spring, he repaired the wheel again, not because it would work, but because it had always been. Repaired and rituals have their own kind of power. He hammered the paddles into place with care, smoothed the edges with a stone, oiled the axle with grease thick as tar, then stood back, waiting. The river did not return, but the wheel moved, just once rocked gently, as though nodding, and that was enough. He kept the ledger still, in a drawer beneath the counter, bound with leather gone soft from handling. Pages, yellowed, corners curled, names, dates, weight of grain, charges owed, payments made. Some crossed out, some circled, some faded completely. He ran his fingers over the ink like it was a rosary. Some days he spoke aloud, to the wheel, to the stones, to the river. Not in anger, not even in grief, just in acknowledgement. As one might speak to a grave, or a god. The windows no longer closed all the way. The wind crept in, carrying with it leaves, and the scent of things from far away. Dust gathered in the corners, like loyal pets. The rafters creaked at night, even when there was no storm out, and yet it was not a sad place, not entirely. The hearth still held heat. The bread still rose. The cat still curled in the same spot by the fire, as it had for years, though it had died 2 winters back. But something of it remained. A warmth, Await. Visitors were rare. A child sent on an errand. A wanderer seeking direction. A peddler who remembered the smell of flour in the air. They came quietly, stepped carefully, left quickly. But they always took something, a story, a silence, a piece of memory clinging to their sleeves. The miller never asked them to stay. He understood the difference between company and interruption. At night, he sat by the hearth, a mug of tea between his palms, and listened to the wind. It rattled the shutters gently, like someone knocking who didn't mind being ignored. He would nod once and sip. And sometimes in the heart of winter, when the world was wrapped in frost, the river would rise a little. Not enough to move the wheel, but enough to trickle, to hum. Enough to remind him that nothing ends all at once. Even a broken river has songs. And so the mill remained, not grinding, not turning, but holding its place beside the water, waiting patiently for the world to shift again. It was not the kind of tavern you remembered fondly, not the type with glowing hearths and music spilling from the windows. This one sat alone at a bend in the road, built more out of need than welcome. A crooked sign swayed out front, the paint too faded to read. Most travelers didn't stop unless they had to. The tavern leaned slightly to the left, like a man who'd taken one too many hard years to the ribs. Its walls smelled of beer and boiled onions, and the floor had a habit of creaking even when no one walked on it. It had no name that stuck, just the place before the woods or that inn with the barking dog. The loft above, it wasn't really a room, just a stretch of boards beneath the rafters, reachable by a ladder older than the tavern itself. It was where the road-weary were sent when the beds were all full, or when they had only a few coins to spare and no one to bargain on their behalf. The mattress was stuffed with something that once might have been straw, but now resembled disappointment. The blanket, if it could be called that, was a scratchy affair that had never known warmth. The beams above sagged low enough to bump your head if you forgot to crouch, and the one tiny window was mostly cobweb, but it was a roof, and when the rain hit hard or the wind carried teeth, even that meant something. Downstairs, the tavern never really slept. Boots stomped. Mugs clanked. Men laughed too loudly. Someone always argued, always lost, and always tried again the next night. Music drifted up occasionally, just a fiddle and a foot tapping out time. But mostly it was noise without rhythm. And above it all, you tried to rest. The boards beneath you shifted with every movement below. Sometimes it felt like the entire building was breathing, snoring, really one big wooden beast, groaning through. The night, you curled up on the mattress, boots still on, one hand on your pack. There was no lock on the loft, no way to tell who might decide to climb the ladder. Trust wasn't part of the price. If you were lucky, the dog curled at the base of the ladder. He didn't bite, but he watched. And that was enough for most to think twice. There was no candle in the loft. Only moonlight through the spider-veiled window, silvering the air just enough to see your breath if it was cold, which it often was. You tucked your coat tighter, exhaled softly, and listened to the night unravel below. Somewhere, someone sang, off-key, with a kind of rawness that made you wonder what they'd lost. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below, and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. Out in the corner of the loft sat a wooden crate, empty, except for the scratches from past occupants who had carved names, dates, curses, prayers. One simply said, "Still here." Another, "Gone but watching." And a third, barely visible, etched deep, "Let morning be kind." You added nothing, but you read every line. Sleep came in pieces, between the shouts and the footsteps, between the creak of the ladder and the scrape of chairs, between the ache in your shoulder and the part of you that never quite let go of fear. But sometimes In the moments between noise, you heard something softer dot, the hush of wind rushing the eaves, the creak of a beam settling like an old man into. Sleep dot the low, steady breath of the dog below, and you remembered that quiet could still exist, even in the loudest places. You dreamt, but never deeply. The dreams were flicker shadows of faces, roads you didn't take, a fire that stayed warm. Long enough to feel real. You didn't reach for them. You just let them pass out at dawn. The tavern grew still. Mugs emptied, laughter faded, doors closed, and the cold light of morning filtered in like forgiveness. You rose slowly, joints stiff, back sore. You folded the blanket, even though no one would care. You rubbed your neck, shouldered your pack, and climbed down the ladder without a sound. The innkeeper nodded. You nodded back. Coins clinked on the counter. A crust of bread, a splash of broth. The only breakfast you'd have before the next town. It tasted like ash, but you were grateful. The dog yawned. The fire died, and you stepped out into the morning. Boots crunching frost, shoulders hunched against the wind. The tavern didn't remember you. But you remembered the loft dot not because it was warm, not because it was safe, but because, in its own crooked way, it held you. And that was enough dot, stretched across the edge of the salt like a breath that had gone on too long. The village, if it could still be called that, was little more than a collection of houses crouched against the wind, their backs turned to the horizon. The air tasted like metal. The ground crunched beneath your boots, not with gravel or frost, but with layers of white, flaking crystals, born from water that no longer visited. Once there had been a lake, wide, shallow, glittering under the sun like a piece of sky had, fallen and never risen again. The villagers remembered it, those few who still remained. They spoke of fishing boats and floating lanterns, of children racing barefoot through warm shallows, of water so still it reflected the stars without hesitation. Now there was only salt, a flat plain of it, broken here and there by the skeletons. Of reeds, the ribs of old boats, and the sun-bleached stumps of forgotten piers. It shimmered at midday, mirage-like, making ghosts out of anything that moved. The wind never stopped. It blew in from nowhere, carrying nothing, and passed through the village like it was searching for someone who had already gone. It lifted shingles from roofs, peeled paint from doors, whispered into cracks in the walls where warmth used to. Live the houses sagged, their wood swollen and split from years of dry wetness moisture that never quenched, only lingered long enough to ruin. The salt crept into everything, window panes, firewood, even the skin of the people who stayed. Their hands cracked in patterns that resembled the flats themselves. They stayed because leaving was harder got. Where would they go? What would they take? Even silence has weight when you've carried it long enough. There was a well in the center of the village, once deep, once sweet. Now it gave only brackish water with a taste like old nails. Still, they drew from it, boiled it, strained it through cloth. They had to. The body does not care for romance, it only knows thirst. Bread was flat and hard. Made with flour, they traded for dried fish or goat's milk when traders came through. Fewer came each year. The road had buckled. The wagons didn't like the dust, or the way it clung to the wheels, as though trying to pull them back. The animals had mostly gone. Chickens taken by foxes or fatigue. The last cow had died 2 winters ago. A dog remained, lean and gray, who barked only at dusk, as though warning something not to come closer. There was a church, of course. There always was. Its bell had not rung in years. The rope had snapped, and no one had bothered to fix it. The priest had stayed until he stopped believing someone was listening. Now it was just a building with tall windows and pews that smelled of rot and wax. The children didn't laugh anymore. They played still, but their games were different, quieter, less joyful. They built castles of salt and crushed them with bare feet. They lined up pebbles and dared each other to walk until the village vanished from sight, then ran back. Crying got the elders sat by doorways in chairs that leaned as much as they did. They watched the horizon, not with hope, but with patience. They had seen the world move once, and now they waited for it to move again. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. The sun was cruel. It reflected off the flats in ways that burned from below as well as above. Eyes squinted from habit. Hats were patched with shadow. The salt crusted on lips and left tongues thick and quiet. When it rained, which it sometimes did, briefly it came as a surprise. People stood in it, not with joy, but awe, as though seeing an old friend who had aged beyond recognition. The drops hissed against the earth, then vanished. The flats refused to hold them. The ground was thirsty, but not welcoming God at night. The stars were brutal in their clarity. So many, so sharp. They filled the sky like a warning. You could see. Forever, and yet nothing ever came. Only the wind. Only the quiet. There were stories told in whispers of how the lake disappeared. Some said the gods took it back. Others said it dried because the people stopped praying. Others still said it was never really a lake, just a dream they inherited from ancestors, too tired to tell the truth. But they all remembered. Even the ones who said they didn't. They remembered. The way boats used to creak at night, moored to nothing. The way frogs used to sing so loud they drowned out the crickets. The way the air once smelled like fish and flowers, not just salt and loss. One man tended the shrine at the lake's former edge. He placed stones in a circle, lit a candle when the wind allowed. No one joined him, but no one mocked him either. It was important that someone remembered in that way. Even ruins deserve reverence. Even ghosts deserve shelter. And so the village remained. Not living, not dying, just existing. A salt-crusted breath held between centuries, waiting for the sky to change, for the earth to crack open, for the water to come home. It sat at the edge of the compound, past the line of wilted fig trees and the worn stone path that never quite dried. The smallest room, the last door on the row of stone huts, with walls more moss than mortar, and a roof that sloped low enough to touch if you stood barefoot. They didn't call it a colony aloud, not within the walls. Inside, it was simply the place where people stayed, the ones the rest of the world forgot or chose to forget, the ones with skin that flaked, faces wrapped in linen, hands tucked deep in sleeves, not from modesty, but from mercy. The smallest room was built last, out of what remained. Spare bricks, a bent wooden beam, cloth nailed across the cracks where wind slipped in too easily. It wasn't meant to be permanent, but nothing in the colony ever was. Not the visitors, not the promises, not the pain. Inside, there was just enough space to lie down if you curled your knees. A couch no wider than a coffin. A shelf with a bowl, a spoon, a candle stub. The window was only a slit, angled to catch the light once a day, when the sun passed through the trees just right. Most days it missed. The person who lived there wasn't old, but illness has a way of aging the body before the mind is ready. They didn't speak much anymore, and when they did, it was in hums and sighs language meant for no one but the dust. They'd come late, after the colony had shrunk, after many had died, after others had simply disappeared into the woods, not out of escape, but out of exhaustion. The smallest room was the only one left, and so it became theirs. The others left food outside the door each morning. A crust, a bowl of lentils, water in a cup made from a hollowed gourd. Sometimes a flower from the trees. A silent offering. A reminder that even now, even here, someone cared. Inside, time didn't move. It pooled. Days lost their shape. Light fell in the same place, then vanished. Nights crept in like fog and lingered long after morning tried to return. They kept a piece of mirror in a cloth, not for vanity, just to check, now and then, how far things had gone. The face in the glass changed often. New shadows, new softness. The kind that comes when the body begins to fade before the soul agrees to leave. Music came once a week. A flute played by someone in the center of the colony. Slow, breathy notes that drifted into the corners. The smallest room always heard it last, as though it had to pass through every other heart before reaching theirs. There were no visitors, no letters, no voice calling their name from beyond the trees. Only the wind, and even it was quiet here. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. Still, they lived. They lit the candle when the matchbox allowed. They warmed their hands over the flame and whispered to it, as though it could answer. They folded their blanket each morning, even when their fingers ached. They brushed their hair with a comb missing half its teeth. They dreamed, too, not of miracles, just of warmth, of touching someone's hand without shame, of walking through the village again, face uncovered, smile unhiden. Sometimes the dreams brought music, or the scent of stew, or a laugh that might have been theirs once. In those moments, the smallest room became something else, a place where memory pressed back against the cold. And then the candle burned out, the dreams softened, and the silence returned. The colony changed around them. New walls crumbled. The fig trees stopped flowering. The footsteps outside their door grew fewer. But still, the tray came each morning. Still, someone remembered. And when the day came that no one answered the gentle knock, the others waited, gave it time. Perhaps they were resting. Perhaps the wind had finally lulled them into a sleep too deep to stir from. But eventually, the door was opened. They were there on the cot, hands folded, blanket drawn to the chin. The candle melted into itself. The room smelled of lavender and old wood. They had left as they had lived quietly, without anger, without spectacle, with a breath that barely stirred the air. They buried them in the grove behind the colony. No marker, just a pile of stones and a branch placed across the top like a resting arm. The smallest room remained, empty, but not forgotten. The others cleaned it, placed fresh cloth on the cot, lit a candle, let it burn down slowly until it extinguished itself with a final, delicate sigh. And sometimes, in the wind, they thought they heard humming. Just a note, a tone. As if someone somewhere remembered. And that was enough. The room wasn't really a room, more like a hollow pressed between stone and sky. A chamber with one narrow slit for a window, so thin a finger couldn't pass through. And through that slit, only a sliver of the outside world could be seen, a slice of gray sky, a corner of the courtyard below, a suggestion of birds that never came close. It was near the top of the tower, but that meant nothing to the one inside. They had not climbed here. They had been brought, carried maybe, dragged perhaps. The steps had been too many, the air too thin, and by the time the door had shut behind them, the world they had once known was already far, far below. The walls were damp, always, even when it hadn't rained in weeks. Stone does not dry where sun never reaches, and in that chamber there was no sun, only the constant breath of cold that came from nowhere and never left. There was no bed, just a pile of straw, moldy in one corner, flattened in the middle, stiff in another. It smelled of mildew and memory of the last person who'd lain there, and the one before, and the one before that. No one ever cleared it out. It flattened with each body, as though learning the shape of suffering by repetition. The prisoner didn't cry, not anymore. Tears are a luxury, and luxuries run out quickly in a place like this. What mattered was warmth, was stillness, was listening for footsteps that meant something was coming, food perhaps, or a man with questions, or the silence that stretched out when even the guards forgot you were there. Food came once a day. A bowl pushed through the hatch, porridge that tasted like wet stone, bread that had more crust than crumb, water in a cup carved from horn, enough to stay alive, not enough to remember what flavor was. The straw was where they spent their days. It was where they sat, knees to chest, arms tucked in, head bowed. It was where they dreamed, not because they wanted to, but because dreams came uninvited, like mice, quick and clever, and gone the moment you reached for them. Sometimes they dreamed of warmth, a fire, a wool cloak, the smell of stew. Other times, they dreamed of nothing, just darkness, the kind that feels like silence made visible. The only sound was the drip. Somewhere above, or maybe beside, water fell at irregular intervals, not often enough to mark time, just enough to remind them they had ears. Drip, silence, drip. Rhythm that came and went without reason. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. There were scratches on the wall, not words, just marks. Some tallied days, others seemed random. A swirl, a line, a shape that looked like a bird, or maybe a hand. The prisoner added one once, just to see what it felt like. The stone resisted, but the straw provided a stiff stalk, and after enough scraping, a new line joined the others. It meant nothing. It meant everything. They spoke to the straw sometimes. Whispered stories, not real ones, made-up ones. About people who had escaped. About towers that cracked and crumbled. About keys left in the wrong hands. They spoke softly, as though the walls might be listening too. The guards never came in. Just the footsteps, the tray, the rattle of the hatch, then silence again. Sometimes a voice called out another prisoner, higher or lower. Never clear. Just syllables bent by stone. A cough. A cry. A laugh too loud to be sane. The straw itched. It clung. It poked through clothes. It crawled up the back of the neck like a breath with too many teeth. But it was a bed. A place to lie down. A surface that was not stone-dot at night, when the wind changed. It sang through the window slit. A low, hollow whistle, like a flute made by ghosts. The prisoner listened, counted the notes, matched it with their breath dot in time. The straw began to feel like home. Not in comfort, but in consistency. It didn't change. It didn't leave. It didn't ask questions. It was there, every day, every night, carrying the shape of a body that hadn't moved in hours. They forgot how long they had been there. Time became circular. The same hunger, the same aches, the same patch of light across the wall that appeared once a day and then vanished. The straw whispered too, when they shifted, when they coughed, when they wept without sound. It whispered like someone else might. Be listening, like someone, somewhere, had laid here before and left a message in the fibers. And maybe they had, because when the guards came one morning, and the hatch didn't open, but the door itself did creaking, groaning, swinging wide, the prisoner didn't move. Not at first. They waited, to see if it was real, to see if it was another dream with teeth. But it stayed open, and a voice said nothing. Just stood there, holding a torch, the light bouncing off the wet stone like it was afraid. And the prisoner stood, slowly bones cracking, muscles remembering. They looked at the straw one last time, at the shape it had made of them, at the life it had held without judgment. Then they left, and the room stayed behind Dot and the straw, quiet as ever, waited Dot for the next name, for the next. Silence. For the next story to be whispered into the cold Dot. It stood at the far edge of the harbor, beyond the docks and warehouses, where the land became waterlogged, and ships no longer bothered to moor. The shanty was built not from ambition, but from necessity, scraps of driftwood, bits of broken mast, and sailcloth too worn for the sea. It leaned toward the ocean, as if waiting for something, or someone, to return. The salt air had long since stripped the paint, if there ever was any. The wood was bleached white and gray, smooth in places, splintered in others. Nails rusted red, staining the boards like forgotten wounds. The door hung crookily on leather hinges, flapping gently, always half open as though expecting visitors that never came. Inside, there was only one room, small enough that you could touch all four walls without moving far. The floor was sand, packed hard by feet and salt water. A single window, once glass, now just a hollow frame through which the wind sang a low, mournful tune. There was no bed, just a hammock strung from corner to corner, sagging low enough to almost touch the ground. Beneath it, scattered shells, bones of fish, bits of rope and twine, things left behind by tides or hands too tired to tidy. A lantern hung from a nail in the wall, glass cracked, wick trimmed short. Oil was scarce, and it burned only when darkness pressed too close. Its light was yellow and unsure, throwing long shadows on the walls, shadows that moved like memories, like figures pacing silently. Whoever lived here or had lived here never fully belonged to the village nearby. Fishermen spoke of them vaguely, using few words. Strange, they'd say. Quiet. A few whispered mad, but never loudly. Madness had many names, and loneliness was often one of them. In daylight, the shanty was empty. A hollow thing. Just wood and salt. But at night, something changed. It felt fuller, heavier, like breath caught too long underwater. Fishermen avoided it then, steering wide at the sands that shifted like ghosts beneath their feet. Inside, the hammock swayed gently, even without wind. The lantern flickered as though someone breathed near it. The air thickened, smelling of kelp, wet rope, and old grief. If you listened carefully, you might hear whispers, not words exactly, just sighs shaped into syllables by the wind. They said the one who built the shanty had lost someone at sea. A wife, perhaps. A child. A brother who never came home. So he built this place, not as shelter, but as vigil, watching the horizon, day after day, night after night, waiting for sails that never appeared. He stayed until he couldn't, until the sand claimed him, or the sea, or sorrow too deep to carry. And after he left, the shanty remained, waiting as he had waited for someone to return. But no one ever did. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below, and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. Over the years, storms came and went, tearing at the wood, loosening. The walls widening cracks that let moonlight seep in like silver whispers. But the shanty held. It bent, but did not break. As though loyalty had seeped into the wood itself, travelers sometimes stopped to look. They peered through the doorway, squinted into corners, shook their heads, and moved on quickly. Something in the air felt too private, too personal to disturb. Children dared each other to touch it, to run inside and back again before counting to 10. They rarely made it past 3, bolting back, eyes wide, laughter nervous, boasting loudly of bravery they didn't feel. Gulls perched on the roof, but only briefly. They squawked and moved on, leaving feathers that drifted lazily inside, landing on the sand like quiet apologies. When the tide rose, water seeped beneath the door. It curled around the hammock posts, licking at the bones and shells, then retreated, leaving behind salt lines on the walls like rings marking each high tide, each storm, each night spent waiting that sometimes. An old fisherman left something by the door, a scrap of cloth, a piece of rope, a stone polished by waves. Not offerings exactly, but acknowledgments. A quiet way of saying they knew what it was to lose, to hope, to linger. The shanty held its ground, even as the sand beneath shifted, even as dunes crept closer, swallowing everything around it. Driftwood fences vanished, docks crumbled, ships sank, but the shanty stayed inside. Memories clung to the walls like smoke, stories without endings, conversations unfinished, promises never broken, just interrupted by silence too deep to cross out. It never became comfortable, never warm, never safe. But it wasn't supposed to be any of those things. It was a pause, a breath held, a moment stretched too long. A place where grief found shape, where waiting became a kind of faith. The hammock swung, gently now, as though finally at rest. The lantern flickered, burned low, and finally died with a gentle exhale of smoke. Outside, the waves broke softly, whispering to the sand, calling, retreating, returning, always returning. The sea remembered what the shanty held dear, even if no one else did. And somewhere, in the distance, beneath a sky heavy with clouds, sails appeared, white as bone, thin as ghosts, coming closer, slowly, carefully. Or perhaps it was just a trick of moonlight, a wish shaped by wind and memory. Either way, the shanty stayed, waiting quietly, holding space, keeping vigil until the sea reclaimed it. Piece by piece, the inn above had once bustled, bright with laughter, songs spilling through windows like candlelight. But now, it sagged quietly into itself, shutters hanging loose, roof tiles cracked. Its walls held more whispers than voices, and the air carried more dust than warmth. Beneath it all lay the cellar, low-ceilinged, cool, carved deep into the earth. A forgotten place beneath a forgotten place, lit only by stray sunbeams that squeezed between floorboards above, thin as needles, pale as ghosts. The stairs down were steep and narrow, worn smooth by feet that no longer tread them. Each step creaked, softly, as though apologizing for disturbing the stillness. At the bottom, shadows waited patiently, stretching out like arms that didn't reach for anything anymore. The cellar had once stored barrels wine, beer, salted meats. Now only emptiness filled the corners, and the barrels stood hollow, their iron bands loose, wood dried and split. They lined the walls like old men resting, slumped together, dreaming quietly of days when they'd held something precious. There was a table in the center, heavy oak, warped and scarred. Its surface bore marks from mugs slammed down in laughter, knives that had carved initials of people long gone. A single chair sat beside it, tilted slightly, as if expecting someone to return. On shelves along the wall were jars, once filled with pickles, preserves, spices. Now empty, dust-covered, their labels faded to whispers. A few remained sealed, contents turned dark and uncertain. No one opened them. No one needed to know. The air down here was thick, scented faintly of old fruit, damp earth, and the lingering trace of spilled ale. Moss crept along the stones in places where moisture still clung. Small puddles formed after rain, reflecting the ceiling like mirrors of a world turned upside down in the far corner. A cot lay folded against the wall, thin, mattress stuffed with straw that had long since crumbled. Blankets stacked neatly, frayed at the edges, soft from age. Someone had slept here once, maybe a servant, maybe a traveler who had nowhere else to go. Now the cot was untouched, undisturbed. A spider wove quietly between its legs, spinning a web as delicate as memory. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below, and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. Above, the inn's floor creaked gently, sighing beneath its own weight. Sometimes footsteps wandered across slow, uncertain, like ghosts returning out of habit. Voices rose softly, distant echoes of laughter. Songs hummed quietly, drifting down like dust. When night fell, the cellar grew colder. Shadows deepened, gathering in corners like tired friends. The beams above groaned softly, settling into sleep. The cellar didn't complain. It simply held its breath, listening to the quiet movements of the building above, waiting patiently for morning. There was a window high on one wall, small and barred, facing the street outside. From it came the faint glow of lamps being lit, of horses passing, of whispered conversations between people who didn't know anyone listened below. Sometimes animals found their way down, mice seeking crumbs long gone, a stray cat chasing dreams. They sniffed carefully, paused, and vanished again, deciding the quiet was too heavy, the darkness too gentle. In winter, frost crept inside, painting delicate patterns across the stones. The floor turned slick, the air bitter, breathing clouds. Into corners. The cellar endured, holding its silence close, wrapped in cold like a blanket. And still, no one visited, until one evening, footsteps came down the stairs again. Soft, hesitant, careful. A woman, old, hair silvered, shoulders bent. She carried a candle, its flame dancing uncertainly in the draught. She paused at the bottom, eyes scanning slowly, remembering. The table, the barrels, the cot in the corner. She touched the wood gently, fingers tracing scars left by lives long past. She opened a jar, sniffed, smiled faintly at the sweet scent of old peaches. She sat in the chair, candle flickering beside her. She didn't speak, just listened to. The quiet, feeling the weight of memories settle around her. She came each evening after that, sometimes humming softly, sometimes sitting in silence. She swept the dust gently, wiped down the table, straightened the blankets on the cot. She breathed life quietly back into the cellar. Little by little. It wasn't the same as before could never be, but it was something. She brought bread, cheese, sometimes wine. She ate quietly, candle burning low. Shadows moved softly, grateful for company. The cellar remembered warmth, remembered life. When the woman no longer came, the cellar waited, quietly, patiently, as it had learned to do. Days stretched again. Shadows returned. Dust settled softly, covering footprints, reclaiming space. But something had shifted. A warmth lingered, faint but real. A memory held gently by walls, by floor, by air itself. Above, the inn continued to fade. Shutters broke. Free, floorboards cracked, roof sagged lower. But the cellar stayed steady, quiet beneath it all, holding on to moments that mattered. No one came down the stairs again, but sometimes, late at night, a faint humming drifted upward. Notes soft, uncertain, sweet, carried by drafts, whispered, by shadows. Those who passed outside felt something. A pause, a gentleness in the air, brief and inexplicable. They hurried onward, not knowing what they had touched, only that it mattered somehow. And the cellar beneath the dying inn remained. Not forgotten. Just waiting quietly, holding memories, keeping stories safe until someone returned to listen again. Deep in the heart of the swamp, where trees stood twisted and water moved slowly beneath thick blankets of algae, lay a hamlet few knew and fewer ever visited. It was not a place you found by accident. The path there was barely a path at all, more a whispered route through reeds, between roots that reached out like fingers from dark waters. The hamlet wasn't named, at least not officially. It had no marker on maps, no signposts pointing travelers toward it. Those who lived there called it simply home, though outsiders, on the rare occasion they spoke of it, called it something else, that place, or sometimes, quietly, the marsh. Houses. The houses were built on stilts, wooden beams thrust deep into muddy earth. They leaned slightly, as if uncertain about standing upright. Roofs were thatched with reeds, damp always, green in patches where moss claimed a home. Walls were planks of cedar, blackened by moisture, weathered smooth in places, splintered in others dot between the houses. Wooden walkways stretched above water, dark enough to hide secrets. Boards creaked softly with each step, sometimes cracking. Beneath the weight, they were repaired often, patched carefully by hands that knew every plank, every nail. Water was everywhere underfoot, beneath homes, pooling around the roots of ancient willows that drooped like tired ghosts. It seeped into everything: boots, clothing, walls, until dampness became normal, dryness a distant memory. The air smelled of peat and decay, mingled with smoke from fires that smoldered rather than burned. Insects hummed continuously, a low, endless drone that rose and fell like breathing. Frogs sang at night, their croaks layering softly, blending into something close to music. Those who lived in the hamlet moved slowly, deliberately, careful not to disturb what lived beneath. They wore boots thick with mud, clothes patched many times, faces creased by moisture and quiet endurance. They spoke little, words chosen carefully, voices hushed as if afraid the swamp itself might overhear. Meals were simple fish caught in, woven traps, roots dug from waterlogged earth, wild herbs gathered carefully, tasting sharp and green. Bread was rare, flour a luxury brought from distant villages and traded for skins or dried fish. Food was cooked over low fires, smoke drifting upward lazily, scenting the air with warmth and hunger. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. Children learned early not to wander. The swamp was not forgiving. Paths shifted overnight. Weeds moved quietly to hide roots home. They played quietly on walkways, small hands making boats from bark, sailing them briefly on still water before they sank gently. Lost to darkness, the elders sat by doorways, watching carefully, eyes following shapes beneath the surface, reading. Ripples like stories written in water. They knew the swamp intimately, recognized signs outsiders missed, the way birds moved before storms, how silence thickened before something hidden stirred beneath the depths. Visitors rarely came. Those who did arrived cautiously, guided by someone from the hamlet who ventured out to meet them halfway. Traders mostly, carrying sacks of salt, flour, cloth. They never stayed overnight, eager to leave before shadows lengthened. Before the swamp whispered louder. At night, the hamlet drew close. Fires burned dimly, doors latched carefully, windows shuddered against the dark. The swamp breathed louder, insects humming with insistence, frogs calling urgently. Water slapped gently against stilts, a quiet reminder of the thin line between safety and something older, deeper, waiting beneath. Inside the houses, families slept close, sharing warmth beneath blankets damp at the edges. Dreams here were vivid, filled with water, roots, shapes moving quietly beneath surfaces, sometimes peaceful, sometimes troubled, always real enough to linger upon waking, leaving footprints in minds. The swamp claimed lives quietly. Someone slipped from a walkway, disappeared silently into dark water. A child wandered just a bit too far, lost in reeds that whispered softly, hiding paths home. Loss was mourned quietly, briefly. Then life moved onward, slowly, deliberately, leaving small shrines by doorway shells, feathers, woven reeds, markers of memories held gently. The hamlet changed slowly. Houses sagged lower, Boards replaced one by one. Children grew taller, moved carefully like elders before them. Seasons passed with quiet consistency, marked by rains heavy enough to blur horizons, by sun hot enough to crack mud into intricate